Hello, ladies, and welcome to our study of Wuthering Heights. I am thrilled to be beginning this particular novel. It's probably my favorite novel that we read sophomore year, so I really can't wait to go on this journey through Wuthering Heights with you all. Before we begin, I am on senior retreat right now, so if you have any questions or anything's confusing to you, or you're reading and you don't understand something, you can email me and I will be able to respond fairly immediately. I'll be checking my email, all today, all tomorrow, all the next day. So please email me if you have any questions about Wuthering Heights. So with that, we are going to go ahead and get into these notes. I want to give you as much background information as I can before we begin. That way you are good to go when you start reading and you're not confused, hopefully, about any of the characters or anything that's going on. So as I go through this, please take notes on your notes handout as well. First, I want to talk a little bit about Emily Bronte. Emily Bronte is, of course, the author of Wuthering Heights, and she was a woman, and she was writing in, the early 1800s. Wuthering Heights was actually published in 1847. So at that time, we know that it wasn't universally accepted for women to be writing or publishing their writing. And so she did have to write under a pseudonym or a false name. And her pseudonym was Ellis Bell. So it's kind of a little bit interesting. She kept her initials, Emily Bronte, E.B., Ellis Bell, E.B. So she did publish Wuthering Heights under the false name, pretending to be a man. Emily Bronte had kind of an interesting life. She died of tuberculosis fairly young, and tuberculosis is when you are coughing up blood. It's not really a serious disease anymore because it is treatable, but at the time, many people died of tuberculosis. And she actually died because she refused to get treatment. She knew she was sick, she was coughing up blood, and yet she refused treatment. And so this begs the question, did she want to kill herself? And a lot of people think that yes, she did. So that kind of sheds some light into this novel. The fact that perhaps she may have intentionally committed suicide by refusing treatment. It's kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind as we're reading this novel, and I think it sheds some light on some of the decisions that these characters make. So keep that in mind as we begin reading. Emily Bronte is one of three very famous sisters in the literary world. Her oldest sister is Charlotte Bronte, and Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre. Some sophomores did read Jane Eyre instead of Pride and Prejudice this year, and I know that a lot of you have seen the movie on Netflix. So Charlotte Bronte is the eldest of the Bronte sisters, and she wrote Jane Eyre. The youngest Bronte sister is Anne Bronte, and she's also a well-known writer. She wrote The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. It's not quite as well known as Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre, but it is still an incredible work in its own right. So, with that, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about Wuthering Heights. I want to give you as much background information as I can because there are a lot of characters and they do get a little bit confusing. So, first things first, Wuthering Heights is a frame narrative. Now, you probably studied this last year or in middle school, but a frame narrative is a story within a story. So, when Wuthering Heights starts out, we actually start with Lockwood, a man who is not the main character in the novel by any means. He's actually not an important character at all. But he kind of stumbles into this world, and someone ends up telling him the story of what happened at Wuthering Heights. And so it is a story within a story. So the actual story that we're going to be reading doesn't really start until, I believe, chapter 4. So the first 3 chapters are kind of building up to that, and then you'll see that someone decides to tell Lockwood a story about some people that lived at Wuthering Heights. So the novel begins in 1801, like I said, with Lockwood. And this is a man that has recently moved to Thrushcross Grange. And Thrushcross Grange is a house in the moors of England. And that's something really important that you may want to write down. The moors of England, M-O-O-R-S. Moors basically are a expanse of very dry, very rocky land. You could kind of think of like rolling hills or rolling fields, except they aren't really lush with vegetation. They are a little bit dead, kind of rocky, maybe marshy in some places. And so it was a very lonely kind of environment, a very harsh environment. And so this is by no means a pretty place to live. But this is where Lockwood has decided to live for whatever reason. And so he rents Thrushcross Grange in the moors of England. And his landlord, the man that he's renting from, is named Heathcliff. Now, Heathcliff is one of our protagonists of this novel. Heathcliff is who it's all about. He is kind of the star of the novel, and he's a very interesting character, and he's very mean, as you will see in the first couple of chapters. So in these first chapters of the novel, Lockwood goes to visit Heathcliff at his home, and Heathcliff lives at Wuthering Heights, which is the namesake of the novel. Wuthering Heights, by the way, is kind of an interesting place, so pay attention to the descriptions of the house, because the house is very, very important in this novel, and it helps you to understand the characters a little bit better. While at Wuthering Heights, paying a visit to his landlord, Lockwood meets a young and very cruel, very rude teenage girl named Catherine. Now, this is where things get confusing, and I'm going to get to this in a minute, but there are actually two Catherines in this novel. And at first, Lockwood meets the younger Catherine. She also has a mother whose name is Catherine, but at this point in 1801, the older Catherine is dead. So just make sure that you're clear on that. When we first meet Catherine, we meet the daughter Catherine. The older Catherine is dead in 1801. Lockwood is then forced to stay the night at Wuthering Heights, and while he's there, a lot of very weird things occur, and you'll see that in chapters 1 through 3. Then, when Lockwood returns to his house that he's renting, Thrushcross Grange, Lockwood is very curious about Heathcliff and Catherine and Wuthering Heights. He is intrigued. And so Lockwood asks his housekeeper, Nellie Dean, and Nellie Dean, or Mrs. Dean, works at Thrushcross Grange. And so Lockwood asks her, what's going on with these people in this house? I'm really interested in the story. And so then Nellie Dean starts telling Lockwood the story of Heathcliff's past. And she begins 30 years in the past. So she jumps back to 1771 and starts telling Lockwood about Heathcliff's history and everything that happened at Wuthering Heights. And that's where we get that frame narrative, that story within a story. First we meet Lockwood. He's really not a significant character, but through him and through Nellie Dean's story to Lockwood, we see, what happened to Heathcliff and what happened at Wuthering Heights. So we start in 1801, but we're going to jump back to 1771 and get the story from there. Okay, now, hopefully to make things a bit more clear for you, I want to go through kind of the family tree in Wuthering Heights and sort of what's going on with all of these characters, because there are a lot of characters and a couple of them have the same name. So this is at the bottom of your handout, and I recommend that you kind of make notes on this and maybe highlight like I've highlighted just to keep things straight. We're going to start with Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw. That's kind of where the story begins. Now, of course, in 1801, they're already dead, but when we flash back to 1771, they're very much so alive. And we start with Mr. Earnshaw, and he has two children. His children are Hindley and Catherine. Hindley is the oldest, and Hindley is a boy. Catherine is the youngest, and Catherine is a girl. Now, Mr. Earnshaw one day decides to adopt a boy named Heathcliff. This is an orphan that he found. And he brings him home, adopts him into the family. Now, as you can kind of see here, Heathcliff and Catherine become very good friends and ultimately fall in love, which is a bit strange since they're adopted siblings, but we're just going to kind of go with it. So, Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw now have three children. Hindley, the oldest, who's a boy, Catherine, and then Heathcliff, the adopted child. And we don't really know much about Heathcliff because, of course he's adopted. We don't know his past at all. Hindley and Heathcliff end up hating each other, but Catherine really, really loves Heathcliff. So that's kind of what we have going on there. Then we meet this other family, the Lintons. They come in a little bit later. And the Linton family, I drew a dollar sign there because they have a bit of money. They are a wealthier family. Now, the Lintons have 2 children, Edgar and Isabella. Edgar is the older one. He's a boy. Isabella's a girl. Now, Edgar, as you can kind of see here, I tried to draw these lines. Edgar and Catherine ultimately get married, and that's why that little M is between them with that line connecting them. Heathcliff, of course, is not going to be happy about that, and so Heathcliff and Isabella eventually get married, and you can kind of see there's that line connecting them. Now, if you zoom out, you can see that Catherine and Edgar end up having a child named Catherine, and Heathcliff and Isabella end up having a child named Linton Heathcliff. Now, this is one of the confusing things in the novel. Because Heathcliff is an orphan, he does not have a last name. His name is just Heathcliff. He doesn't have a last name, he only has a first name. So when he has a child, this boy named Linton, Linton's last name becomes Heathcliff because Heathcliff only has one name. Heathcliff is his first name and Heathcliff is his last name, which can be kind of confusing. So just wanted to make sure that that was clear. Heathcliff's last name is not Earnshaw because he's an adopted child. He is not a legitimate child of the Earnshaw family. Okay. Then if you look here, Catherine and Edgar got married. They have a daughter also named Catherine. And just kind of by doing the math and using logic, you know that Catherine's last name has to be Linton because her father is Edgar Linton. So that's what we have going on there. Just to be clear, there are 2 Catherines, okay? When the novel starts, we meet this Catherine. We meet the daughter because this Catherine, the older one, is already dead. So I want to be very, very, very clear about that. In 1801, we meet the younger Catherine, not the older Catherine. The older Catherine's already dead. We meet the younger Catherine. Then we're going to flash back and meet the older Catherine. Okay. So I think we're all clear on that. Then over here, this isn't super important right now, but Hindley does get married to a woman named Frances, and they have a son named Hareton Earnshaw. So just be aware of that. I really recommend that you take some time to study these names and keep this with you as you're reading because this little family tree is going to be essential to your understanding of the novel. Keep those 2 Catherines straight as you begin reading. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. I hope this was helpful, and I hope that you enjoy your study of Wuthering Heights.